We are back for another coffee session. This is round two of Luigi in production. We are graced. I think you are the first person to come back for two times for the coffee
Oh,
session.
well,
That is,
I'm flattered.
this is amazing, man. We had to have you back because the first time was too good. I felt like it got cut short, and I have so many more questions that have been just percolating in my mind for the last couple months. And in this session, since you just mentioned to us that you are moving up the ranks and you're starting to focus on different pieces of the puzzle when it comes to machine learning, we really want to look at the organizational problems and the organizational kung fu that you've had to do with machine learning and trying to figure out the business value that it brings, how to articulate things. We talk a lot about being a translator, how you can
Hmm.
be a translator in the machine learning puzzle. So, before we even start with any of that, I think it would be good to catch up with what you've been doing since we last talked. We were just mentioning that you stopped with the newsletter because you're focusing your energy in other areas, one being that you've got a growing family, so congrats on that.
Thank you.
And the other piece is that you're doing different things now. You're not so focused in the code, if I'm not mistaken. Can you give us an update?
Yeah, absolutely. That's pretty accurate. Like you mentioned, I paused on the newsletter mostly because I needed a little bit of a break, and I was rethinking just a lot of different areas of my life and really how I allocate my time. I think that's really what it comes down to, right? At the time, I was writing the newsletter plus all ML production things, which took up about 30 to 40 hours a week, I would say. And I was working my full-time job, which was another minimum 40 hours a week. Plus, we were expecting a new member of the family. So when my son was born, we really paused and wanted to rethink how I allocate my time across these different parts of my life. And I thought it made sense at the time to take a little bit of a break from ML production, at least in the form that I was running it at that time. So like now I'd say, still spent plenty of time at work, my full-time job, and actually refocused there, primarily because my team has been growing. And I went from managing two people to managing five people, and basically all of the machine learning production projects that the company I work for, relies on day to day. So it's a pretty sizable increase in responsibility, and it warranted, my focus there, especially as it's my primary means of financial existence,
Yep.
essentially. So been spent more time there, and I think that time has really paid off. I've learned a lot, gotten a lot of new experiences, which I'm happy to talk more about here today. And yeah, as you mentioned, I'm no longer in the code. I'm not actively writing code each day, but my position is extremely technical. I just needed to sort of move, up the levels of abstractions, a couple of levels. So I'm still very involved in technical decision making, but I'm not actively writing the code. But I am
So
working with people who are writing the code, and I'm still in code reviews. I'm still in, still giving advice, still thinking through the models and the architecture, definitely, but
mm,
trying to get more of my teammates involved in some of that decision making.
what has that transition been like from being the one that's writing it to being the one who has the bigger picture? Are you more privy to more information so you can see more? Or is it that you are just able to get more done because you can outsource more?
Yeah, good question. I think it's a little bit of both of those things. I think I'm finding that I really enjoy being a manager. I know oftentimes in technology and in engineering and development, there's often this fear that, going into management means giving up, coding or being so close to the metal, let's say. And I think that really doesn't ring so true to me because I enjoy the more expansive view of thinking about technology, and machine learning is just a piece of technology. It's just a method, really, in terms of the problems that it solves. I think that's what always gave me an advantage when I was more active writing online, was that I was always focused on solving a problem rather than on using a particular tool. Although I spent a lot of time writing about tools, I did so more from the perspective of, well, here's a problem I have and I want to solve this problem efficiently. And I think this is the tool that solves that problem very efficiently. And now that I'm, focused on, moving up the ranks or not in the code, I get to spend more time learning about the actual problem. And I can really leverage my knowledge of, architecture, infrastructure, machine learning, and bring that to bear on, the problem. And as you said, I can sort of, quote unquote, outsource the work to, people to implement. And although it's easy to think about it as outsourcing, I think I prefer to think of it as most efficiently utilizing resources at the company, right? And data scientists and machine learning engineers are resources at a company's disposal. And if you can really do a good job of matching people's strengths to the particular parts of the problem, I find that one, you solve the problem really efficiently, but two, you also have the most productive and enjoyable work for people who are doing the work.
Yeah.
Right. So the data scientists actually wind up enjoying their jobs much more if they find that their skills are being utilized, very efficiently, because modelers are doing modeling work, engineers are doing engineering work. You don't have modelers spending a lot of time writing glue code, which they may not find enjoyable. And I think you get a lot of synergy, although that's a buzzword. But I think I think a good manager, and this is what I strive to be, a good manager does a good job of solving the problem, but also, making the lives of the people who work at the company very enjoyable.
So when you're looking at a problem, and I love that you're so problem focused, like problem centric, and you're really focusing on how and what is the problem, how can we go about solving it? Are there steps that you're taking? Have you figured out a process for identifying problems and trying to work through them? Or is every problem new and you have to figure it out on the fly?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. If we can sort of think about a problem, or let's think about a problem that would eventually have some sort of machine learning solution. And if we focus on the productionizing bit of that, I do think I have a pretty good idea of a process to follow. And I think that's really demonstrated in the past couple of months of work that my team has been doing, in that we took several models from development notebooks to, production ready, producing tens of thousands of predictions each day with basically zero downtime. And, we were starting basically with, very prototypey code in Jupyter notebooks. And now we have, production processes that are producing predictions. We have data validations, which are, constantly checking the quality of the data in the pipelines, things like drift monitoring, and even things that are, more simple, but are extremely helpful. Like, are these fields the right types? What kinds of values do we expect? All the way through to, to monitoring at the tail end of the entire process. So I think from that perspective, I tend to feel that the process that we employ is pretty good, and I'm happy to talk more about that. If we're thinking in terms of like project intake, let's say, I think I've found that, I'm still improving there and learning there, but I really benefit from having strong leadership and a chief data scientist who has a seat at the executive table and has his finger on the pulse of what the most important problems at the company are. Because I think, your team, it's necessary, but not sufficient to have very strong, high level leadership who can really help you focus on what the important problems are. Because if you have those problems, and you make incremental gains on those problems, that can translate into huge wins for the company as a whole. Whereas if you work on problems that, you can work on problems where you have huge benefits, but that you have huge gains, but that actually translates into relatively small benefits for the company as a whole, because you're just focused on, an incremental win rather than something that could have, real sort of transformational power.
That's such an important point. Like, to really focus on the problem that is going to be the most important for the company.
Right.
Not, wow, great to hear you say that and to break it down like that, because I think it's easy to lose sight, let your eye off the ball, right? And then you start working on problems that you feel like this is going to have a huge benefit. And then it does, but it's not necessarily the benefit that is the most impacting for the company.
Right.
So the last thing I will ask, and I would love to get into the process in a bit, but you talked about the last 3 months and this process that you've gone through, and you've had you've had a lot of success with it. Have these all been different problems that you're looking at? And so you've been able to take a few different use cases and put them through the process, and they've all worked out? Or is it a few of the same use cases, just a little bit different?
No, I would say the main problem or project that we've been working on, and I can't go into too many details just because of proprietary stuff. It was an entirely new problem and had many new facets, lots of interactions from different people at the company. Involves a lot of actual experimentation, right? So it's not just modeling work, it's not just producing predictions, but then running very large scale online experiments, a la like A/B tests across the company and across different behavior of our employees. So this was really something that was like completely new, and also the interface even between the machine learning outputs and the people consuming them. So like a more of a UI question was something completely new that our team had to confront. But I believe we're doing like an awesome job at tackling that problem. So the main sort of problem that I've looked at through the lens of this process, I've adopted is completely new to my team, and I think we're having we've done a really great job of working on that problem.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned, taking Jupyter notebooks, making them production ready, putting in place data validation, putting in place all the things that make ML ready for production. One of the things I struggle with, because this is my job at my company, is how much of that is structured as one-offs, and how much of it is part of a rational platform strategy, where you say this is the way we will do it going forward every single time. And how do you as sort of a senior manager of this group, articulate that portion of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something I always have in mind, because I tend to think in terms of automation as much as possible, right? I like to have that process, or preferably I like to have that sort of code base that does the work for me, right? But you can spend a lot of time upfront investing in that automated solution just to find that it's not the correct one, either because the abstractions aren't correct or you wind up never using it again. Right. So, we spoke a little bit last time, Demetrius, you've quoted me a couple of times in terms of not doing something manually before you automate it.
I was just going to say, I just wrote something about you saying that.
Yeah. And I stick to that, but I will say that there is you can think of like a pipeline in terms of getting to the automation, right? You don't go from doing it manually to, perfectly automated. I think there are steps you take along the way, and I try to always instill that in the mind of the people on my team. And we can sort of think of one intermediary step as like you do things very manually, but then the next step can be setting up some process where you basically go through the same steps of the person who did the thing manually for the first time, but it's more of like human level automation rather than like code level automation, right? So one way you can think of it is I tend to, a couple of years ago, I discovered this like TDSP from Microsoft, right? And TDSP comes with a lot of these nice sort of markdown files that you create as artifacts of an analysis or a modeling experimentation. And it basically involves a data scientist after he or she trains a model, go through an error analysis, and you do this nice write-up, right? And there's a couple of these different markdown files at different stages of the ML lifecycle. So one of the things I've implemented at my company, or the company I work for, is every data scientist needs to produce one of these files after doing particular stages like model building or running an experiment. Now, if we think in terms of, so those files are completely related to the model building process. Now, a separate part of data science is experimentation, A/B tests, that sort of thing. And TDSP doesn't include markdown files or templates for doing that. But we've, as a team, started to do a lot of A/B tests. It's something that's new to our team. We weren't formerly doing it very, very much. But I've asked. It started as when you're about to run an A/B test, you want to understand the metric that you're seeking to optimize, essentially. And when you're determining things like sample sizes, you need to have a good understanding of the just natural variability you expect in that metric, so that you can compute, the duration of that experiment, for instance, and what level of power you'd like to achieve. So at first, this was a totally manual process for my team, right? We hadn't done it before. So I wanted people to, and our team, to get used to the process and understand just what are the difficulties involved in doing this sort of work. So after running, a couple of experiments and sort of getting the hang of it, I've asked my team now to come up with the templates, to come up with the markdown files that we should fill out each and every time we run an experiment, right? And thereby basically institutionalizing the knowledge that we've gained from doing this work manually and putting it into some process.
Oh, wow.
Right. And what this allows us to do now is we've done a bunch of learning, and now we can spread that knowledge to other data scientists who may not be as familiar with the process, but they're basically taken through a checklist of steps that they need to complete and numbers that they need to compute in order so that we feel a bit, some level of confidence that we understand the experiment we need to run. So that's like an intermediary step, right? We can take this one level further and build an experimentation platform where all of this work is automated, and that's what most of the major technology companies have done, but we're not there yet, right? We have much more to learn, and we have much more. I'd like to see much more tangible results before we make a big investment in the platform solution, right? So that's how I like to think about it.
So I'm gonna have to edit a few of those blogs that I've written about you and add this little caveat at the end saying, do it manually first, then jump into doing it and creating a knowledge hub, because I think that is fascinating. You're bringing the learnings to the whole team, so it's not siloed with that one person who did it manually and has gained the experience from it. That's huge.
Right. Yeah, and eventually, that doesn't have to be just a team artifact. That doesn't have to be a data science team artifact. That can be a company-wide artifact, right? Because experimentation is not something that should be limited to any one particular part of an organization, right? You can experiment on an online product, a la LinkedIn, Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. You can also experiment on organizational processes, right? Is your contact strategy that your sales team employs as optimal as it can be, right? Is the cadence of your phone calls or the topics of your conversations optimized towards particular types of prospective buyers, right? These are things that you can experiment with. Although it's a bit nuanced, and it might be a bit more complicated than just, does a user click on a particular sales page? It is something that you can optimize, via the scientific process. So, this is where those artifacts can be useful for other teams, other parts of your organization, right? That, we like to think, in terms of, a rising tide that lifts all boats, and data science can sort of be that. Any team can be that if you're always thinking about, how to institutionalize the knowledge you've gained in your day-to-day processes and operations.
I think one of my favorite things about the conversation you had last time that I listened to, and this conversation already, is that you can really you can really spin a vision, right? I can definitely see that from the way that, you talked about how to invest logically in a platform, how to do it, incrementally, iterate, and from a sort of like a machine learning engineer standpoint, from an individual contributor standpoint, I really appreciate the fact that you can put out that vision and communicate it so well. How do you do that at 2U, with where you think the company's data science efforts should go? It seems like you guys have a chief data scientist that you work with. How does that sort of happen?
Yeah. So just to make sure I understand the question correctly, are you asking how do I formulate the vision that I'm communicating to the team?
Yeah, exactly. How do you formulate it, and how do you communicate it to the whole
Sure.
to the whole organization?
Sure. Yeah. Good question. I think as I meant, I've been at 2U now for almost for 3.5 years, almost going on 4 years, and it's been in my career, it's been the company that I've been with the longest. Prior to being at 2U, I worked for several different startups, basically each for around one year, right? And I've really learned something in being with this company for a much longer period of time, at least relative to the other places I've worked at in my career, which is you just learn so much from sticking with a place, right? That it gives you the ability to, learn from the past and to leverage those lessons, right? So you learn, what types of things have you tried that didn't work? What kinds of relationships with stakeholders have you had that didn't lead to the best outcomes? And I think that was something that, in the first half to 2/3 of my time at 2U, we failed a lot of times. And I don't think we failed in terms of building technology that didn't work, but I think we failed in the sense of working on problems that just didn't have that big of an impact. And I consider that a failure, right? And that's a failure of leadership, really. And I was part of that leadership for some time. I was also an individual contributor at certain times. And I think that's a bigger, just as we said earlier, that focusing on the right problems can lead to the biggest gains. Focusing on the wrong problems leads to the to the biggest problems, right? Because you're effectively your team or your organization is a cost center for the company, right? It costs money to employ data scientists and machine learning engineers, and if you're not producing results because you're not working, you may not be building out the main product or service that the company offers. You may be more of sort of like an optimization center, which I consider my team to be. And if you're not optimizing the business, well, then you're not succeeding as a team, right? So essentially, you're just hemorrhaging money. Now, hemorrhaging may be like a really strong term, but I just like the word. And you could be a very expensive team that's not really living up to its fullest potential. So going back to the original question, I had several of these experiences, and I would say I'm very fortunate that our leadership pivoted and we're now focusing on the right problems. So essentially, I'm able to leverage all of those previous learnings, right, to help formulate the vision. I think it also really depends on having just, being focused on the problems is super important, right? If I was only focused on, am I using a particular type of neural network, I wouldn't be able to formulate any such vision. It really depends on my ability and my other senior managers' ability to understand what the business problem is and to think very strategically about how we can solve that with any technology, machine learning or data infrastructure, and how we can we think through what the 10-star solution would be, and that may be a couple of years worth of work, but then can we break that down into baby steps of how we get there, right? And if you're always thinking through, if you're thinking about like what the ideal solution could be, yet are sort of agile enough to be able to pivot and iterate as you need, and have a team that's really hardworking and can adopt that vision and see where you're going, I think that makes the communication much easier, right? So I know I gave a really long-winded answer, but in summary, it's, I would say having having some history at the company, knowing where you failed and where you can sort of win, having good ideas and understanding of the business problems you're seeking to solve, and how solving those could lead to really big wins for the company, and a bit of charisma. If you can, there's always that always helps, right? Being able to communicate the thing in a particular type of way can always help sort of rally the troops.
I really appreciate everything that you just walked us through there. I often mention this in MLOps.community discussions, or, I think last week in our meetup, I mentioned this, but this problem-driven mindset has to be a core part of working in machine learning nowadays, because, a lot of people look at all the tools that are there. They look at all the things that you can do, but nobody's, what really matters is what you have to do and what you have to solve. And that problem-driven mindset, I think one of the things it also helps with is that at your company, people may not understand the work you do, but they understand the problems you all face. And communicating in terms of that can really help bring down the sort of barriers between teams, which is crucial for putting machine learning into production. I think one thing that you mentioned was really interesting about how you felt that there were some hiccups in the process of really getting the data science team to focus on the right thing. And I'm curious, did you feel like the company's senior leadership or your company overall understood that? Or was it more a process of like you realizing, hey, we're not working at the top of our license, so to speak?
Yeah, I think, I think people or employees who are individual contributors or even sort of junior or mid-level managers, I think aren't privy to a lot of the conversations around what the real problems are. So, to some extent they are, but also to a very large extent they're not. And because of that, I think you can have a pulse on the fact that you may not be having a huge impact, right? Because it's easy to know that you're not having a huge impact, right? Your team's not getting recognized. Your name is not in the organization-wide emails, that sort of thing. But it's still hard to know what the right things to be working on are, right? Or who the right stakeholders to be engaging with are. Oftentimes, those people may not even be senior leaders themselves. So there could be some just general friction in working with them and achieving goals, which is why I think I'm a big believer in just you need to have really strong senior executive leadership, right? Because without that, I think the probability that you are engaged with the right stakeholders and collaborating, working on the right problems, I think that probability is very small. I don't think it's impossible, but I will say that I don't think I've had success. Definitely haven't had as much success working without the really strong leadership who, we're talking like at the seat of the table with the CEO level, knowing what the right problems are, knowing what to focus on. So I think that's super critical. So I'd like to say, in an ideal world, I'd like to say, yeah, I found the problem and now we're working on it, but that's just not true, right? I was able to understand. I felt that we weren't having as big of an impact as we could, and that was a very sort of frustrating experience. But I myself, and even some of my teammates at the same level or just a level above me, we really had trouble sort of finding out what where that optimal place was, and it didn't change until our senior leadership took a bit of a look at itself and figured some things out.
That makes sense. And the reason I ask that question is because in a lot of companies, the data science and machine learning and even the AI groups, they hold an exalted status because you tend to hire some very smart people for it. But what they do is not that clear. Their impact is not that clear. And I think how teams realize that and how teams change that is probably one of the most interesting things to me, because I think I've felt that way. My company, I work in a regulated industry, in healthcare. Every model that we have to put into production, even the idea of it has to go through an extensive verification validation process, and that can really, I think, at our company, we have had, some jittery feelings about the idea of putting machine learning into production. And so I recognize that my impact was not that great because those kinds of conversations were happening at the senior level, as you said, and I was not privy to them. So it's interesting to hear how you dealt with that and how you worked with that.
Just one more thing to say there. I think it's interesting in that I think, you don't really want to be communicating in terms of things that a machine learning team doesn't want to be communicating with non-technical stakeholders in terms of things that they've built. I think you want to be because only the data scientists or ML engineers understand those things. And it's fun to talk amongst your team about those things, but when it comes to talking externally, other people just aren't coming from the same place. It's most beneficial to talk in terms of value providing, either in terms of shared metrics that everybody understands, or in terms of some shared vision that multiple teams are working on, right? So what's the simplest metric that people can understand? I think that's just dollars and cents, right? Can you say that we've reduced costs by X dollars or increased revenues and sales by Y dollars, right? If you can speak in those terms, I think then people can really understand how beneficial your team is, right? If you have like a $100 million revenue company and you're saying that, we increased revenues by like 1%, well, you added another $1 million to the revenues, and that's something that everybody can understand. Sometimes you can't get to that dollar and cents level. For instance, Vishnu, as you mentioned, you could be working on some models that may never actually get integrated into the product because they didn't succeed during the validation process. But oftentimes there, I think it might be helpful to think in terms of just like a funnel, right? If you're working in that sort of environment, not every model you produce is going to get integrated, right? It might be something like on the order of, I don't know, 1 out of every 10 models or 1 out of every 100 models. I don't know. I'm not in the industry. So you can say like, look, our overall team has a conversion rate of 1% or 10% when it comes to building these models, right? And you can see your efforts then as increasing the number of trials, which at the end of the day, if you keep the same sort of conversion percentage, you'll increase the number of things that you actually add to the production system, right? And sometimes I like to say to our team, like, look, most experiments are going to fail, but we're not going to find the ones that succeed unless we're running a lot of different experiments, right? So you should think of yourselves as measured in terms of the number of experiments that we run. Now, of course, if you set up an incentive structure in that way, even if you're not sort of recognizing people based on those incentives, you want to make sure that you can't really easily game the system, like just running some trivial experiments or anything. But that's where, if you have a team that's built on integrity, that sort of thing may not happen, and you can fix it. But thinking in terms of a funnel, I think sometimes is helpful, especially when you don't have success every time. You want to measure that rate of success and just how many sort of pitches you throw to get there.
It's a huge quote right there. Most experiments are going to fail, but you're not going to find the ones that succeed unless you do that. It's like totally. The cliche Jordan quote, right? Yeah, exactly. What was the...
you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
That's it, exactly. Just spun for a data scientist. And so I kind of want to, and I completely agree with this. How many times have we heard that upper management is wondering what the hell is going on with the data science team because they're not adding any business value and they're taking up a lot of money? It's like, we're spending a ton of money on these guys, and maybe they only have a few things happening on their laptop. So what's going on? And I can relate, and it's probably not any fault of the data scientists, right? These men and women are tasked with certain things, and if they don't have that clear leadership, like you talked about, and they don't have a problem that they know is going to really make an impact, then how can it's like before they even start, they're handicapped greatly. Now I want to change gears a little bit because I've been reading this book, Creativity Inc. I don't know if you read that, but there's a chapter in it where he talks about the hidden. And this is like everything that he cannot see. As he was, and for those who don't know about Creativity Inc., it's the founder of Pixar, who later went on to run Disney's animation. And obviously, he created a gigantic company with Pixar. And one of the things in this chapter that I found fascinating was how he really tries to dig in to things that he cannot see. Because if you're sitting at CEO level, A, you're not going to be given the information about who's fighting with who or who's really hard to work with. But then B, you're just going to think that because we got something right once, that was because our process was correct, right? When maybe it's not like that. And so I'd love to know, where do you think you have blind spots right now within your organization and within what you're doing?
Interesting. Well, I guess the interesting thing about blind spots is you don't know you have them, right? So, if you do know you have them, you should probably get to working on them. I would say, let me not speak for the company, but I'll speak for myself, right? In terms of like what blind spots.
Perfect.
I think I may have. I would say, certainly in terms of business knowledge, that's something that I'm actively trying to work on and gain, right? My background is not in business or in product. My background is really I have a very, very technical background, right? So, in school, I studied math and computer science and a little bit of physics, right? So just all of these just very technical topics. When I joined the workforce, I was in the data field from the very get-go. So working on some data engineering, working on ML engineering, data science, now management, in technical topics. But I have a very, very strong interest in the business side. So, what are cost drivers? What are revenue drivers? What's the value prop that your company is sort of offering, and not just like today, but how is your company trying to innovate and build new things that are going to satisfy and delight customers? So I would say, my biggest blind spot, but at least that I recognize, but I'm working on improving, is my sort of knowledge on the business side, which can also include product side things. And actually, if we think about that, I'm very I've never really had much experience on sort of topics of like user interface, user experience, and these sorts of things. So that's something where I actively need to work with people who are experts in those areas and try to leverage those resources, right? So I think something that's perhaps new managers struggle with, and something certainly I've struggled with, and I'm actively trying to get better at, is not just working on the things that you're really good at already, but figuring out ways of scalably improving the areas where you are not an expert, right? So questions of interfaces and design, I am no expert, right? And because of that, I would tend to shy away from problems or business opportunities where the UI and design is a larger component, but that is a blind spot, right? Because I could be missing huge business opportunities or huge opportunities for the team that I would be able to take advantage of if I figured out how to leverage the people around me better, right? So I don't need to be the expert, but I need to be able to bring in the experts and work with the experts. And that's, as I was always a sort of a workhorse type of person where like I like to write the code and I can like spend days and nights writing the code and I can figure it out. And I think those types of people tend to miss out on opportunities because they haven't figured out how to not do all of the work, right? Because if you need to do all the work, you want to be good at all of the work. So you won't do any of the things that that require skills that you don't have. So figuring out how to leverage people who have those skills and work on problems, I think opens up makes the subset of problems you can work on much larger. So opens up a sort of a potential for more opportunity in the future. Sorry, I thought of a lot of those things on the fly. So hopefully that answer made sense.
No, it did.
Completely.
It totally did. It totally did. I think, two things to flag there, right? One is the translational capacity for data science professionals is absolutely crucial, right? You were saying that, to some extent, you would like to get even better at translating between what data science means to UI or business or product, et cetera, right? There's all those realms that data science could impact, or even just in general that drives the business that you would like to understand in order to make the data science team more effective or to further your own goals. And so that translational capacity is huge. And then the second thing, really being around how to be an efficient manager, which I think is very tricky. I think I definitely agree. A lot of new managers, their response to becoming a manager is to work harder, and that's not necessarily, and to become an expert in all the things that they may not know, right? So that they feel like they're playing on the same playing field as their reports or whoever they work with, and the challenge really is to work, not harder but smarter, right? That's the challenge of being a manager. So totally understand what you're saying there. My question to you next is something we've been discussing a lot in the community is, continuous learning as a professional, right? And how to do that effectively. And I think we touched on this, last time in the podcast, but, how has your perspective on that changed as the topics that you've been trying to learn about have changed?
Yeah, great question. First of all, I think it's absolutely important that you're just always learning, right? So regardless of what field you're in, regardless of what you're doing, whether it's professional or extracurricular or recreational, I think it's just always learning is just so important. And I think it's really part of who I am. Whether that's topics at work or topics outside of work. I sort of like, if you look behind me, like there's this bookshelf, right, which kind of looks hilarious because most of it is empty. And and the reason for that is, I moved to San Diego a couple of months ago, and most of my books are in the garage, still packed away in boxes. But the books that I do have on the bookshelf are just the ones that I've read in like the past couple of months, that I bought on Amazon. And not saying that it's a lot of books or few books, but you're just really to say that every day is an opportunity to learn something new, and you need to do that. I've sort of adopted a motto for myself over the past couple of months, which is a default to reading, which basically means
Nice.
to me, like if you find yourself having downtime, read something, right? If you find yourself like bored, read something. If you're waiting online at a store for something, read something, right? It's very interesting to think about it. People say, oh, it takes, how many books do you read? Or it takes so long to read a book, or like, how do you read so many books? Or not that I read so many books, but, how do you have the time to read any book, let's say? And I think it's kind of interesting to think about that because, most books, you can probably read a book in 5 to 10 hours total, right? Now, you're never going to read the book cover to cover, or maybe you are, but I don't read books just cover to cover in 5 to 10 hours. That 5 to 10 hours is spread out over, a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever, or months sometimes. But think about how long it took the author to actually write the book.
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
I mean, it could have been thousands of hours, right? Especially books that are written over a lifetime of experience. So like, what's the trade-off here? Like you're putting in maybe 10 hours to read a book that took like maybe 10,000 hours to write, right? So you get the benefit of all of that knowledge. Now, of course, you don't have all of that knowledge. You have just a tiny subset, whatever's written in the book, but you get the benefit. Yeah, I think the trade-off is in your favor, right? In terms of the units of work you have to apply and the amount of knowledge you gain. I think you get a pretty good bang for your buck in reading a book, right? And if it's obviously you want to read the good books, and I think it's easy enough today to find what the good books are, right?
Yeah.
There's plenty of blogs, and you can talk to the experts and find out, listen to a podcast, and they'll tell you what the best books are to read. I'm also a big believer in sort of an idea I got from Nassim Taleb, which is like the Lindy effect, right? The things that have been around the longest probably have the most value. Some new book that was written today may never be read again in like just 5 years, but the books that are still being read after hundreds of years are probably very valuable. And, something else I believe is like, look, you can enter any new field, pick any field. No matter how eclectic, professional, non-professional. If you read the top 10 books in that field, you'll probably know more than the vast majority of people in that field. And you certainly won't look like an idiot in any conversation with any expert in the field.
Oh, great point.
Right? Like you'll very easily be able to answer most questions that people will run into just in working in that field. Now, you're not going to be an expert, right? You may not be you're not going to be an artist in that field, but you'll have a lot of knowledge, right? So one of the things I did when I started being a manager is I picked up the 5 to 10 books and read through them, and I learned so much, right? And I find that a lot of the things I run into at work, people have already run into. People have already spent a lot of time thinking about. Now, do I want to spend all of that time reinventing the wheel? Or do I want to devote 100 hours, less than 2 weeks of reading some books and be able to tackle most of those questions? I think you read the books. It's really not that much. It really doesn't take that much time relative, and it doesn't. You'll fail a lot less often, at least up front. You'll fail less often on the easy problems.
Right, and I think the other thing that I would add to that is, in addition to giving you the knowledge that maybe the experts have, those top 10 books, what they allow you to do is structure it and act on it in a way that even if you had all the lived experience, you may not be able to as easily, right? I know, for example, with MLOps, right? Being able to communicate things in a meaningful fashion to others. I may have put, even if I'd put models into production for the last 10 to 15 years, if I didn't have that ability to kind of say, okay, this is the way it's done because I read it in a book, and this, it's written by experts, and B, it makes sense. It wouldn't really mean all that much, right? I wouldn't be able to act on it. And so reading books and using that as a means to act on that knowledge, I totally agree. Probably should get back to reading a little bit more than I have been lately.
Yeah, I mean, it's very important to act, right? And reading the books is not a substitute, but it is a it gives you some material there to work from. So you definitely need to act. I'd say, definitely read the books, but think about how to, apply those lessons and problems that you're working on, right? And actually, do that. Otherwise, you're not really taking full advantage. But still better than not reading the books.
Yeah. What are some of the ones that you've read recently that jump out at you? Come on. Maybe it's just the most recent. That's usually the easiest one to remember. But other ones that you would recommend?
Is there a particular topic, machine learning or management or?
Let's go with management.
Management. Probably the sort of Bible is High Output Management by Andy Grove. Andy Grove is was the CEO of is it
Intel.
Intel? Yeah, I was like, is it IBM or Intel?
Yeah.
Intel. Yeah. So he was the CEO of Intel for like many years, and actually he started out as an engineer. So it's pretty interesting. It's interesting to read, a good management book from somebody who transitioned from being an individually contributing engineer, right? And it's literally like the Bible of
machine
management.
Learning?
For machine learning, if we're talking about technical topics, if you really want to learn, let's say, like algorithms really well, I don't think you can do better than hands-on machine learning, which is the what's his name? Can't believe I'm forgetting his name.
Jerome?
Yeah, Aurelian Jerome book.
Right.
He just put together like some sort of masterpiece in terms of like, applied knowledge and just the right amount of theory where you feel like, you're not skipping out on the hard bits. You're still getting some theory, but it's just so practical and applied that I think it's going to be hard to top that book, in the foreseeable future. A book that I read recently that I'm really, really enjoying because it's not just tech. It's mostly not technical, but it's just very organizational. Is Trustworthy Online Controlled Experiments, which is a book that was published, I think, last year, and it was written by three authors: Diane Zhu, Ronnie, where is it? Ronnie Kohavi and Tang, and all three of them have led experimentation teams at companies like Microsoft, LinkedIn, and I believe Google. And this book is specifically about the operational and organizational challenges of how to basically build organizations that are built on top of experimentation. Oh, wow. And so they don't just talk about the technical, like, this is how to run an A/B test, this is the statistics for it, but they talk about how to build a platform, how to think through incentives and metrics, and it's just filled with case studies and experience from real life. So I think this is a fantastic book. I think I'm mostly through it, and I've actually made it sort of required reading for the people on my team.
Oh, that's incredible. We'll link to that in the show notes for anybody that wants to check it out. And I think I'm going to have a look at it too. If it's required reading for people on your team, that says a lot.
Yeah, it's definitely a great book. I'm really enjoying it just because of how it's not just a technical book. It's really a technical, like, business book, right? Like, how do you do this at scale at a company? How do you solve all these people problems, these process problems? How do you think about these problems? Very valuable.
Fascinating. So last thing before we wrap up, I know that you're moving up in the organization, and I wonder, this is just a bit of a personal question, scratching my own itch. How much are you thinking about the ethical implications of machine learning now? Does that come into your mind at all, or is that still, or has it always been there, or is it not that big of a deal?
Well, it certainly can't not be a big deal, just in terms of regulation and legislation and things like privacy and data privacy. And, you need to, at the very least, be compliant, right? And being compliant today means, it's always meant following laws, but there's an increasing number of laws related to things like privacy. I don't think my definition of success in general includes integrity, right? I don't think you can be a successful person really unless you have integrity. So just from a personal perspective, I think, being an ethical person, employee, data scientist, those are all important things. I would say that, you always need to be, I really value, like, privacy and liberty, which is, I think, one of the challenging things to think about if you're a machine learning person, right? Because machine learning is predicated on, leveraging data to uncover insights that wouldn't otherwise be able to be uncovered. And I think at times that can mean striving to get data from individuals or from other companies that you might not otherwise need from an operational perspective, just so that you can build models or get these insights. I think personally, I prefer to try to, really squeeze out all of the juice from the data that we have than, getting additional data from users that we don't really need for operational purposes. Right. So I think one way of bringing ethical practices to machine learning is to collect the least amount of data necessary. Right. And typically, if you don't need that data for operational purposes, you can make the argument that you don't really need to collect it at all. Right. So users will give you some amount of data just through their interactions with your applications or services. And I think that's pretty fair game, right? You have that data, you built the services or the applications and you're able to collect that stuff. I think it's your duty to communicate to the users, how you're using that data. And I don't think any company does that very well today, at least the companies I'm aware of, right? So these things that you have to, these 100-page documents or things that you need to click on and say accept, I think that's just total bullshit, right? Nobody reads that stuff.
Yeah.
You can say that like you're being compliant, but nobody reads that stuff, right? If though you have a company, I think a gold standard would be, a company communicating to its stakeholders or to its customers in layman terms what types of insights they're trying to uncover from their data, right? And it doesn't mean giving away your trade secrets, right? You can intentionally make certain things. You can say basically the types of problems you're trying to solve without, explaining how your models are built, right? For example, if you're doing lead scoring, you can say like, look, we're trying to figure out which prospective buyers are most likely to become customers, right? And we leverage these data points about people to do that, right? I don't think you're giving away any trade secrets there. But again, the devil's in the details. So I think it's always easier to talk in terms of sort of abstractions and generalities this way than actually talking through what it means to implement that. Personally, I'd say, it is challenging to be somebody who is in machine learning, but also values sort of privacy and liberty, because the two are a little bit at odds with each other. So understanding sort of how to toe that line, I think, is something I think about often.
Brilliant points made. I love it, man. And there's still so many questions that I wanted to ask you, but it seems like the time flies when we talk to you. So you may be the first person to come back on 3 times now.
All right.
After all this. This is incredible. I really appreciate your viewpoints and seeing your evolution and seeing how you really are focusing on some of these problems. You're really taking a problem-centric way of solving things, how to figure out what is going to create the biggest impact in the business, creating processes around that, iterating on those processes, creating the knowledge hub so that it's not just for the one data scientist or the data science team, it is for the whole company. I think you've said so many brilliant points. There's so many gemstones in this interview. I may have to go back and watch it a few times before we have our 3rd interview with you for the hat trick. Thank you, Luigi. Thanks, Vishnu, as always. You guys were awesome, and I really appreciate you coming on here, spending your time with us, and sharing some of this wisdom.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it, and definitely looking forward to being back a 3rd time.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And we will all wait patiently for MLM production to come out. The next iteration of MLM production, we will be waiting patiently here like this.
I think all of us, and let us know if 2U is hiring, if your group is hiring. I think a lot of people would be very enthusiastic about coming to work for someone like you and what you're working on. So I know in the community, people would love that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. That's a top level compliment. So thank you.
Right on. We'll see you all later. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.